Okay, hey, how we doing out there, guys? So I just put out a video there a few days ago talking about an attack in oblique order. So kind of keeping with that, we're going to talk about real life examples of that. We'll use the real life, far and away the largest example ever of an attack in oblique order, which is the so-called Schlieffen plan. The Germans' plan for a war against France that ended up being implemented at the start of World War One. Now, it's very commonly been called the Schlieffen Plan for a long time, but it's an incorrect name. Like Schlieffen never planned this. It was actually Helmut von Moltke the Younger. Technically, the name of this plan is Aufmarsch 2 West. So basically, Deployment Plan 2 West. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about the setup and some of the goings on that kind of lead to this and just some of the overall idea. So like we said, what we talked about, the basics of an attack in oblique order is essentially just that you weaken one wing, massively overstrengthen another wing with the hopes of so overwhelming the wing that you have strengthened that you can crush it before you take any sort of bad outcomes on your weakened wing, and then you can roll up the flank that you've just crushed, and then basically destroy the enemy by, either a large turning or circling movement, or just by, taking them in the flank, kind of piecemeal by that. So, kind of talk a little bit about the planning stage of this. So, the Germans at the time of World War One, they were the first, country to ever have what they call the Great General Staff. So, which was extremely revolutionary when they came up with it, which is that you have, obviously a general staff of, staff level officers, but also like, younger officers, and their entire job was basically to work on deployment plans, future like contingency plans for things they think are going to happen, and then to deal with all the, every aspect as far as the military goes, as far as equipping, logistics, planning, those sort of things. But that basically sits kind of, obviously they sit underneath the technical leadership of the government, but they sit overarching the entirety of the military. So in some ways, it's kind of like, today we have the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but they were the first ones to kind of implement that, which nobody else had at the time. So they are, so Germany, if we kind of think about where we're at now, so World War One obviously starts in the summer of 1914. So we'll kind of deal mostly with Western Europe here, but so the Germans have just kind of come through the so-called wars of German unification. So you have the Austro-Prussian Wars, the Schleswig-Holstein Wars. You have the Franco-Prussian War, 1870-1871. And so prior to that, Germany, as we would call it today, was essentially the Prussian Empire, which occupied like the very northeast part of Germany, and then kind of the Baltic areas, going through the Baltic states there, and whose capital, like traditionally, was Königsberg, which is now like sits as a kind of separate oblast, within the Russian Federation. And then you had what was called the North German Confederation, which were a lot of the city states or the palatinates or the counties. Like the Germans kind of had a bunch of different delineations for like the quote unquote, I guess the level of of what you wanted to call a particular area. So they were kind of confederated, i.e., they were separate, but they had like essentially agreed to militarily, and in some ways economically, like work together. You still had a couple relatively separate southern, German entities, Bavaria for one, and then you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which obviously includes Austria and Hungary. But prior to that, there had been the South Germans, quote unquote, also included parts of the Austrians or the Swiss, at least in terms of thinking when it comes to that. So you don't have a quote unquote united Germany. You have by this point now what's called the German Empire, because it includes parts of a lot of what are now separate countries, Poland, Czech Republic, things like that. So as we get past the Franco-Prussian War, or let's say we get to the Franco-Prussian War, the the French had, you know, there's this is a conversation in for its own terms, but the Germans were in control of Alsace and Lorraine, or Elsass-Lothringen, which are ethnically German, German named, German speaking areas. Now they're primarily French because the French have basically gone in and quote unquote colonized them. But the French were very mad about that, and so the French wanted these areas back, and for a lot of political reasons, France was essentially like terrified of being usurped as the premier continental power at the end of the 19th century. They saw the rise of the German Empire, and they didn't like it. So between between them and between Otto von Bismarck, they basically kind of get set on a course for a war. France invades the German Empire in 1870. After it's kind of funny because I'll watch videos now where people talk about the Franco-Prussian War, and they're like, well, the French invaded and the French did all of this or that, but it was just he couldn't really predict it. We don't know what the Germans were doing. Well, no, what it actually came down to is the French literally demanded at threat of force that the German Empire give them like entire German cities, Saarbrücken and the Saarland, which is a coal-rich, kind of industrialized area, as well as in this case, like large parts of Bavaria. And the Germans were like, well, no. And so then the French, it basically became, inevitable the French were going to invade, and then the German Empire absolutely crushed them. So the chances of there being another large scale war, basically everybody always kind of thought there was going to be. Again, it comes down to the French had been the traditional continental power, and they didn't want to lose that, to the German Empire, and everything that came along with that. So they developed deployment plans. The Germans developed deployment plans. Everybody developed deployment plans. We still do that today. It's just normal. So don't read too much into that. So from the German point of view, they had to come up with some deployment plans for a few different contingencies. So by this point, we get into late 19th century, early 1900s. Alfred von Schlieffen, he's the head of the German General Staff. That's why these plans get associated with him. So he's the head of the German General Staff until early 1906. So he comes up with a couple contingency plans. So one plan, which is called Aufmarsch 1, or Aufmarsch 1 West, so deployment plan 1 West, is an assumption of an isolated Franco-German war, i.e. just Germany versus France, in which case his plan is for roughly what we see on the map I have up right now. What we think of the quote-unquote Schlieffen plan is a French attack through the border areas, i.e. northeastern France, and then a German counterattack and a large enveloping action to essentially defeat the French away from their fortifications. Because that's another, I'm going to pull up a different map here. So in kind of dealing with this, we can kind of look at this time. So the border now has changed. So now, Metz and Strasbourg are in France, but at this time, obviously, this is the border here. So we can see where the heavily fortified areas are here. So along the frontier, so you've got Verdun area, we've got Toul, Epinal, Belfort, all there. So these are all the heavily fortified French areas. So the Germans, they basically know, like, hey, if we're going to defeat the French, we can't have as our plan that we attack them through their heavily fortified area. We need to draw them out of the heavily fortified area, and or we need to get behind it and attack them from multiple sides. So that's the Aufmarsch 1 West, the deployment plan 1 West, which would be the actual Schlieffen plan, is that. So if we flash back over to my map, so if we look how this kind of played out like World War One, that's roughly like what happens. Roughly the same idea here is getting the French out of their fortifications. And what the Germans were very cognizant of and very worried about is that they would not be able to bring the French army to a decisive battle, and that the French would defend these fortified areas and then they would fall back towards Paris. And so they call this area here kind of like the secondary defensive zone. So the Germans didn't want to have to try to break through here, and they didn't want the French to be able to retreat fast enough from this area back into the secondary defense zone that the Germans would be unable to bring them into a decisive battle and then, be able to politically end the campaign. So that's their major concern, when it comes to that. So then at the same time, you have additional plans. So you have a plan called Aufmarsch 2 West, so deployment plan 2 West, which is at this time there's a Franco-Russian alliance. So it's an assumed alliance between the French and the Russians, and possibly other countries as well. But obviously, like the Germans' primary adversaries, continentally speaking, France and Russia. And so this anticipated a war against both the French and the Russians, and then included that they would run an active defense in the east, put the bulk of their forces on the west. They would still engage in a defensive-ish campaign to pull the French out, to exhaust the French, and then to attack them with a large counteroffensive, a large circling action. Now, Aufmarsch 2 West, like I said, is what actually happened in World War One. But now, what the primary change that Helmut von Moltke the Younger made here is that he used the large turning action and the general flanking and turning movements of Deployment Plan 1 West, tried to implement that with Deployment Plan 2 West, but the other portion of Deployment Plan 2 West is that the Germans were going to have roughly 20%, so roughly 1/5 of their force would be in the east to defend and to slow the Russian Empire, to buy them time to reach a conclusion in the west, and then to be able to move forces around there. Now, that, obviously, the assumed, plan of von Schlieffen in his Aufmarsch 1 plan is that they don't have to defend against the Russians, so they can send essentially their entire force to the west. So they could have a massively, so a much greater force, in the west. So that's one of the primary, probably the single primary problem that they have there. So now there's also a couple additional plans. So you have Aufmarsch 1 Ost, which is, Deployment Plan 1 East. So it's a plan, it's an assumed war against, again, a Franco-Russian alliance. And this time in which the Germans would deploy more of their force to the east. They would assume that Russia and France would attack simultaneously because they have the greater force and because they have them on two sides. So the Germans were going to conduct essentially active defense, against everybody, and then they were going to counterattack the Russians first and then move against the French after that. Then you have one more plan, which is Aufmarsch 2 Ost, which is, Deployment Plan 2 East. So this assumed for an isolated Russo-German war, i.e. just the Germans versus the Russians, in which case, obviously the Germans could focus, defensively in the West, and then they could, they could deal with Russia in the East. And so they had to have that contingency plan, but they didn't ever really think that that was going to be a thing, because once you had that kind of alliance system, they basically knew that, like, hey, any war is going to involve, the alliance coming into play there. So, like I said, if we flash back over, the fundamental problem with the quote-unquote Schlieffen plan, or Aufmarsch 2, is that von Moltke the Younger assumed the ability to have the troop levels of Schlieffen's plan for an isolated Russo-German war, but with having to also account for fighting the Russians as well. So they were, kind of catastrophically weakened in their total deployment, numbers. Now, did they still have enough to have possibly, brought the campaign to a close? There's a lot of interesting talk and debate on that. But we'll kind of, now that we know a little bit about the setup of the Germans, talk a little bit about the French. So the French, they're doing deployment plans the same as everybody else. So they had a few plans. They finally come up with what's called Plan 17. So here's an isolated map of Plan 17. So the French, they didn't want to violate Belgian neutrality because, as we know from World War One, the British were basically assigned protectorate of the sovereignty of Belgium. So the French assumed that they would not be able to attack through Belgium. So where do you have to attack? Obviously, you have to attack along the common border. So their essential plan was an immediate offensive out of their fortified areas into German areas, which could then basically reclaim the things that they wanted. They wanted the Alsace and Lorraine areas and some of that, and then to get into good defensive areas where they could basically then be like, okay, hey, now time for the politics stuff. We're in a spot that's going to be very difficult for you to dislodge us. Let's come to some sort of different conclusion on this. Now, other people were aware of Plan 17. So, it at this time, probably all militaries did it, but it was very common. The Germans were fanatical about what they called Stabsritt or staff rides. So you would go and you would take train rides and you would ride around areas in Europe where you thought you might have to fight so that you could get an association for the terrain and the logistical stuff like that. So German officers they would go to France and they would go to Belgium and they would, ride around and look at stuff and just so they could kind of get an association for that stuff. So they become aware of Plan 17. I believe Plan 17 was finalized in 1912. I could be wrong about that. Or maybe it was early 1914 after it got kind of updated from Plan 16. But anyways, so a flashback over my map. So if we see how the Germans assumed and the French basically obliged them. Plan 17, the blue arrows here, was a direct attack into the Saarland, and into Alsace-Lorraine, which exactly coincided with what the Germans wanted to have happen, which was a defense, an active defense, and a general, slow retreat from the areas of their left wing, and then a massive enveloping movement to their right, with what would have been their oblique order, their echelon forces over there. So in some ways, this was set up exactly for what the Germans needed to have happen. Now, how this actually, kind of plays out. So there's a lot of things that go on. So I'm going to flash over to the maps here. So again, so here's the French border now, but at this time, like I said, Strasbourg to Metz. So this line right here, that's in Germany. So the Germans, they're put in a couple of rough spots planning wise, because obviously if this is the common border, at this time, the common border would have been more like that. It's a relatively narrow area to try to attack around, and the French, as I've flashed over to, they're extremely heavily fortified in that area. So the Germans decide that it's in their best interest to violate Belgian neutrality because, one, they need to extend the line and they need to get into the Belgian rail and road network. Now, they know that they're risking the British Expeditionary Force coming to the continent, but their guess, or their gamble that they're taking is, we can conclude the campaign positively for us faster than the British can land on the continent and influence the campaign in some other way. So it's a gamble, but it's one that they feel like they have to do, because if they don't do that, then they're extremely limited on what they can do, as far as their deployments. So now I'll zoom in a little bit here. So if we also look, now obviously, we're 2024, so there's significantly more road and rail density and stuff now. But for the most part, a lot of the roads and rails would still be in the same places, just less developed, 100 years ago, 110 years ago. But we look like Western Germany, very well developed, and then we look at Belgium. So a couple main places that the Germans need. So they need Liège, and then associated with that is Maastricht, which is right to the north of it. Very big road and rail network. So as they attack across their common border, they need to get to this rail network so they can get themselves moved over towards this area. So obviously, if we look at the plan. The plan is for this right wing under von Kluck is to swing all the way out, basically to the sea over here in France. So they need this road and rail network. So if we look at here, so von Kluck, he is assumed to be coming essentially through this area north of Lille, and then essentially out to the ocean, over here, out to the English Channel there. So they need to get to this road and rail network so that they can use it, which becomes, the siege of Liège, Belgium becomes something where the Germans get held up for a few days. They have to bring forward, kind of famously, they're large, like 420 millimeter, Big Bertha siege howitzers, and blast them out of some of the forts around there. And then, you flash forward to World War II. When the Germans launched their attack against France, so they kind of famously, have some of their paratrooper elements attack Liège, and there's the famous like glider assault on Fort Eben-Emael, which was, it was assumed that the one missing piece in the Liège defense from World War I was this particular fort overlooking the Meuse River in this one spot. So they build that fort, and then that's what the Germans assaulted with a coup de main and an airborne assault on that. But not to get off track. So the right wing of the Germans is obviously coming over here. The British Expeditionary Force, has landed on the continent, and so now we get a couple of kind of famous like battles, like the Battle of Mons, where it's kind of funny because in British parlance it's considered a oh hey, it was a good thing, like a smaller British force like held up a larger German force and this or that. I remember reading that in books where they talked about like, oh, the British riflemen fired so fast that the Germans thought they all had machine guns, which isn't true. That never happened, and it's one of those just made up things. The entire myth of that comes from like one single German's like diary entry, which just said something effective. We attacked around Mons, and it seemed like the British had a machine gun in every hedgerow. And it's just like, okay, that's significantly different than saying, oh man, the British riflemen with their Enfield rifles fire so fast, it's like they all have machine guns. But the British get basically humiliated at Mons, driven out of Mons, and are retreating back. And now this is where I talked about this, kind of when I was talking about my previous video on the Battle of Austerlitz and talking a little bit about that, which is one of the things that saves the effort for the Entente, for Britain and France in the West, is that when the British retreat, they retreat towards the interior, which means they keep connection, roughly speaking, with the French, whereas the safer thing for the BEF to do would have been to retreat back towards the sea so they could get basically picked up and taken off the continent, which, for France would have been catastrophic. But they retreat, further south, down here, and roughly keep their, association with, with the French. So now, while this is going on in the West, and there's, we'll come back to this. So there's this large attempted turning action, and now I don't think I said this, but the other assumption as far as deployment numbers go here is that of the attacking force against France, about 85% would be concentrated in the first, second, and third armies, whereas the fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh would only have roughly about 15% of the total troop and equipment numbers. Now, now von Moltke got he got cold. He got a little antsy, and this is exactly what I said about the dangers of an attack in oblique order. Is so he started to get very nervy that the weakened left wing would cede ground too fast and would put them in a bad position prior to them being able to use the large encircling movement of the right wing to come to a positive conclusion. So he moves more men into those armies. So instead of being an 85-15, it ended up something more like they say about like a 70-30. So that's a fairly significant departure as far as total numbers. Now, the other side of that is, if we kind of look at the road network and things like that, so you're moving, so up here, so of a deployment of over 1.5 million men on the Western Front, so you're looking at having, 1 million men, essentially, just in the first, second, and third armies there. There's not enough road and rail to do that particularly well. And so that in and of itself leads to a large problem, as far as movement stuff goes. The assumed circling movement of Schlieffen's plan for Aufmarsch 1, it didn't take a lot into account of logistics and kind of assumed that the armies would be able to live off of the surrounding countryside while they were moving, which turned out to be true, but it also assumed they're like, hey, you have to make it through this area and you have to get down to fight this decisive battle. You can't hang around. and this can't be something where we stay there because we can't support that logistically speaking. So they kind of catastrophically weaken that wing a little bit. If I remember my numbers correctly, I believe that von Schlieffen assumed a requirement of 48 corps in the right wing of the German effort there, and they only had like 34 and a half corps. So they were, fairly weakened in that. And then the other thing that von Moltke does is von Moltke, he gets himself really nervy, not only about the left wing of his Western deployed armies, but of the armies in the East against the Russians. The Russians had significantly improved their logistical deployment abilities with loans from the French, and building rail, and just their now they pulling up and having a strategic reserve, as far as manpower and stuff goes. So he kind of looks at the German Eighth Army, which is in the east, and he goes, man, I don't know, I don't think they can do it. Crap, and takes and sends a significant number of men to the east. So instead of having a roughly 80-20 split between the west and the east, it gets more closer to like a 70-30. So that doesn't sound like a huge deal, but if you're talking about deploying 2 or 2.5 million men, and you're like, okay, hey, we're actually going to take 250,000 men or 200,000 men. That's a lot. That's a significant, and it's not just the men, but it also means that you're taking their artillery and everything else as well. So that's a pretty significant weakening of that. So as the attack goes, the Germans are basically, fantastically successful initially. Because the other thing that happens is as the French launch their Plan 17, so this attack, and it becomes like what's called essentially the Battle of the Frontiers. So the Battle of the Frontiers is an absolute disaster for the French. Everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. They take, there was one single day, I believe it was August 22nd, one single day they took 27,000 KIA. It's just like unbelievable numbers and unbelievably bad. So, as this is going on, and obviously as the Germans are, encircling them. So if we kind of look, the assumed encirclement was, west and south of Paris. What starts to happen is, as the French are retreating from these areas and the British are retreating from up here, the German, army commanders, you have von Kluck is the first army commander, i.e. he's the furthest right wing, and then you have von Bülow is the second army commander. They're allowed to exercise what the Germans call Auftragstaktik, which is Auftrags means like mission. So it's basically like mission-oriented tactics, or what, in our parlance, like in America, this is kind of more along the lines of what you call commander's intent. So the idea would be that the commanders are all briefed on like, hey, here's the exact mission. Here's what I need you to do as far as a mission. And then the commander that's in charge of that, he's allowed to make his own decisions as far as how to do that. So in this particular case, if you're von Moltke the younger and you tell von Kluck and von Bülow, like, hey, you're the main hitting force, you're moving to the right, I need you to end up in roughly these places because your job is to end up west and south of the French army. So if they assume that they are west and they are starting to turn south of the French army, they can decide to cut their turning movement short, and pursue them that way, which is what they do. So I'll flash over to a map, the Battle of the Marne. So where we kind of actually end up here by about the end of August and early September is, so remember, the Germans are supposed to be making this large turning movement. Von Kluck is supposed to end up south and west of Paris, but he ends up significantly east of Paris because this is the assumed area where the French army is. What Joseph Joffre does well of the French is he basically says, okay, Battle of the Frontiers, disaster, we got to retreat back to Paris. And the idea being Paris is the major hub, obviously. So that's, all the rail lines run to Paris. That's where the road network is. So the closer you get to Paris, the easier it is for the French to move people around. And the further away you get, the harder it is for them to move around. Another way to think of it is if you're the Germans, the closer you get to Paris, the more mobile your enemy is at the operational and strategic level, and the less mobile that you are comparatively. So they end up significantly east, and this was after a period of the French, and the British conducted what they call the Great Retreat. So, like I said, the British get driven away from from Mons up here in Belgium, and basically they just retreat, days and days and days and days and days, and you know, and every day the French are just falling back, and they get back to a flashback over. So if we look where we're at, so the French get back to roughly this area here, and then they notice that now instead of being echelon and up against Paris, and echelon would mean that Von Bülow's units would be, while technically his advance is in this direction, he would have units echeloned out to the side to guard his flank. Same thing with Von Kluck. So they end up not coordinating with each other very well. A couple reasons for that. One, the two men didn't get along, and then World War One is obviously up until this point, and aside from World War Two, it's far and away the largest conflict that's ever existed. So if we see the Germans have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 armies, the French have 6. Now, what they don't have at this time is an army group level of command. And we see that in World War II. Like on the Eastern Front, for example, you have Army Group North, Army Group Center, Army Group South. The Russians, the Soviets called it fronts. But basically, what you needed here was somebody to be in charge of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd armies, somebody to be in charge of 4th and 5th, and somebody to be in charge of 6th and 7th. But you don't have that. So you have essentially the German High Command, Helmut von Moltke, the German General Staff, are all trying to coordinate this. And so it becomes difficult to coordinate. It gets significantly away from things I've talked about in other videos of the tripartite idea, i.e., kind of a delineation in thirds as far as that stuff goes. So, so the Germans end up not encircling as far as they needed to, because Von Kluck, he kind of got a little nervy, but he also kind of thought he's very aggressive. He kind of thought okay, I am further outside of the furthest elements of the French, so I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. Which he's kind of right about that, but also part of the point of being on this side of Paris is that you cut off the ability of the French to move men from the south up. Because at this time, you're still only roughly a month into the actual hostilities. The French, and all the armies for that example, are still, gathering their folks at their concentration points and moving them to the battle. And so, so him not being there leaves Paris completely open as far as transportation goes. And this is what you actually have happen here, is that essentially the French Fifth Army was an army that the Germans basically didn't really know existed at the time, that gets moved back, from its deployment over there, moved back to Paris, and then it, gets popped into this gap that forms between the first and second armies of the Germans. So the BEF attacks over here roughly through Chateau Thierry, and then the French attack over here, which is what's called the Battle of the Marne. So the Battle of the Marne is what essentially ends the quote-unquote Schlieffen plan and the War of Movement. Then you get the Race to the Sea, and then you get trench warfare. So that's a pretty good overview of it. A couple things to kind of keep in mind. World War I to me is really fascinating because for as much as we know about it, it seems like nobody actually knows anything about it. Because it still gets thrown out all the time, like, oh, trench warfare is just, unbelievably gross and disgusting. You just take all these casualties. It's like, yeah, trench warfare would be absolutely terrible. But when you look at the French KIA, so just the French killed in action numbers for 1914, i.e. from basically early August until the end of the year, is over 300,000 dead. You look at the American battle deaths of World War II, and it's not even 300,000. So the French, so the totals for American World War II is like 400 and some thousand. That includes the non-battle related military deaths. But for just battle deaths, France took more KIA in just the period of basically August to the end of December than America took in the entirety of its fight in World War II. So, and the Germans were roughly similar. So they took, I believe it was like 305,000 KIA total, between the West and the East. So it's just like unbelievably huge numbers, and this is part of the war on movement. Now, then when you look at the rest of World War I, so in 1915 the French take, I believe it's about 350,000 KIA, but that's the entirety of the war in 1915. It drops down to like 185,000 in 1917. Then it's back up to like 250,000 in 1918 with all the offensive actions. But by the end of 1915, the French had taken more than 50%, or basically 50% of the entire KIA that they would take for the war, and you still had 60% of the war to fight. So that's, kind of a scale of just how devastating and how deadly this phase of World War One really was. So for as much crap as field fortifications and trenches and things get, like, one thing that trenches and field works do is they keep people alive. So that's kind of something to keep in mind with that. But kind of ending with the Schlieffen plan stuff, kind of one more time, is to kind of keep in mind, again, in some ways you kind of feel bad for someone. Like, your name gets attached to the largest turning movement, the largest attack in oblique order ever in history, that gets executed kind of well and kind of poorly. There's actually, like, when you read more detail about how the Battle of the Marne came to be, is, obviously we have air power at this time. So the French had seen von Bülow's Second Army attacking more to the north, the assumed flank of what was the French Ninth Army here. So von Bülow starts attacking more in this direction to kind of shore up his stuff, and leaves this gap between him and von Kluck. And so the French had seen the Germans, like, marching down the roads. They come up with this plan. But the Germans had also observed the French moving on the roads in position to attack. And there's kind of the messages didn't get through, or somebody got the messages and were like, it doesn't really matter. So, in some ways it was, it was very possible that the Germans had, just responded correctly, after seeing the French deployments in this area. Because obviously you can't move, the entire BEF and the entire French Fifth Army without people seeing that. In this area, you can take trains and trucks to certain places, but you got to do an awful lot of walking on the feet. So, it's one of those situations where, one, communication is always key, but also having people actually pay attention, having trust in other people. And this is where there's a couple guys, from like they've taught like the U.S. Army War College and West Point and stuff like that, to do some interesting videos talking about like the effect of interpersonal relationships on command. And this is kind of that sort of thing, which is you have two guys, in von Kluck and von Bülow, who don't like each other. Both of them kind of think that they are the quote unquote the hitting power, the main effort. You don't have anybody directly above them, except for just the overall, command of the German military. And so you don't have anybody to come down and like order them to individually have certain corps and divisions do things. So this is the problem of the Auftragstaktik, which is, it's probably more positive than it is negative, giving commanders the ability to adjust, as long as they keep the mission in mind, to adjust themselves on the fly. But at some point, when you're dealing with these huge elements, and I've talked about this in the video that I did, last year or whatever, talking about, essentially like the Battle of Tannenberg and the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes, is armies orient themselves towards a single goal. So von Kluck's, if he orients himself more towards Paris to deal with elements coming out there, but von Bülow orients himself to the south to deal with what he thinks is going to be his flanking movement there. What it typically means is that like they orient all their forces. So he doesn't typically see like, oh, hey, Paris is over there, but I better make sure that I leave X number of divisions over here to help von Bülow. He goes, hey, this is my mission. I orient myself to my mission. And you have to have somebody, or you have to have a good liaison to be like, okay, yes, but you have to keep a continuous line here. So that's the fundamental problem with that. But again, like I said, the quote unquote Schlieffen plan, accurately named Aufmarsch 2 West, or Deployment Plan 2 West, very unbelievably large scale attack in oblique order, extremely ambitious, and from von Moltke's standpoint, extremely poorly administered. In some ways, one of the great ironies of some of the military command is that you have Helmut von Moltke the Elder, who is an actual military genius and extremely successful. The architect of the defeat of the French in the Franco-Prussian War, the Danish and the Austrians in the Austro-Prussian War, and all those sort of things. And then you have You know, his, is it his nephew? I forget the relation, but you have Helmuth von Moltke, the younger, who was kind of just a dipshit. So that's kind of what you end. But again, so talking the invasion of France in 1914, dealing with our attack in oblique order, and that's all I got, guys.